I'm Chuck Tiller, Operations Manager of 1070 KNTH Radio and the morning show host for Bill Bennett's Morning in America on News Talk 1070 KNTH. I want to thank you for coming this evening. This event is sponsored to you in part by Houston Baptist University, the North Houston Tea Party, Takeout Taxi, that's right, One Source Printing, and the Lone Star Flight Museum. Nice place down in Galveston. You ever get a chance to go down to the island, see the Lone Star Flight Museum. It's really great. A lot of B-17s there and B-24s, great stuff. This is Americans United. It's time. In a few minutes, we will be joined on the stage with Karl Rove, whose latest book is entitled Courage and Consequence, My Life as a Conservative in the Fight. And we are in the fight as we come up to November. We're also headed into our 6th year at News Talk 1070 KNTH under the leadership of General Manager Chuck Jewell, who has slowly built our team and evolved our method of broadcasting, not just on the air at 1070 KNTH, but on the internet at 1070knth.com. And now, this year, the really neat thing is, on our website, you can go to the page in the middle, you'll see a little icon there that says mobile. You click on that, that'll take you to a page where you can download an application to your BlackBerry, your iPhone, your iPod, or your smartphone. You just click on the mobile icon, and then you can take 1070 KNTH with you anywhere. You don't just have to rely on the radio. There's a guy I know, he goes to Lake Charles all the time. You go too far east on Interstate 10, you lose KNTH. But he has it on his BlackBerry, so he takes it all the way because he likes to listen to Michael Medved in the afternoon. Speaking of people on the air at KNTH, I want to mention our 1070 KNTH broadcast team who makes it all possible. Lyndon Jocelyn, our news director, Ken Garza, Ron Samuels, and our production director, Marcia Lambeth. We couldn't do this and keep it on the air without these people. They do a good job 7 days a week. Now let's acknowledge the man who has served as the 3rd president of Houston Baptist University. Since August 2006, HBU has experienced unprecedented growth with the addition of 2 new facilities, the University Academic Center and the 6-story resident college called the Lake House. Freshman enrollment has more than doubled since 2006. And additionally, the university has launched the Honors College, developed the College of Continuing Studies, and returned to NCAA Division I competition. He has served as president and chancellor of Baylor University, where he was a member of the faculty and founding dean of the George W. Truett Theological Seminary. He's published extensively and pastored churches throughout Texas and beyond. His list of achievements are far too many to mention here, and we only have a limited amount of time. We could be here all night. He is a native of Coleman, Texas, grew up in Abilene, and is married to former Sue Collier of Cisco, Texas. They have 7 children and 6 grandchildren. And ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you the president of Houston Baptist University, Dr. Robert B. Sloan, Jr. Dr. Sloan.
Thanks so much, Chuck. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm so glad Chuck mentioned our 6 grandchildren. He didn't mention that we have 2 on the way, so we're pretty excited about that. Welcome to Dunham Theater in the Morris Cultural Arts Center of Houston Baptist University. Tonight, I'm so pleased to provide the introduction to yet another in a series of events that has been sponsored by KNTH. Thanks to this radio station, we've been able to provide a forum for esteemed speakers such as William Bennett, Michael Medved, Michael Reagan, and Governor Rick Perry, all in this past year. These evenings have all proven stimulating with very much valuable reflection on public affairs. Karl Rove is here, of course, with us this evening. Though he follows a host of accomplished individuals, I think it's safe to say that Mr. Rove is among the most thoughtful and influential guests ever to speak at Houston Baptist University. It's common in presidential administrations to see appointees come and go. Many serve just a year or a little more and then move on. Life, of course, in Washington is very intense. People, I'm sure, become tired of living in a fishbowl, or perhaps they get chewed up in a controversy, whether manufactured or real. But Karl Rove served for 7 years as a key advisor to President George W. Bush. The president directly credited him as the architect of his successful campaign for a second term in office. Karl Rove played a central role in the administration that faced the most devastating attack on our own soil by a foreign enemy since Pearl Harbor and had to pioneer new approaches for dealing with terrorism. Mr. Rove has distinguished himself in the ranks of political advisors and campaign managers. His record and his credentials call for enormous respect and attentive listening, as does the nature of this forum. I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to hear from him and to benefit from his experience and perspective. I had the pleasure of meeting Karl while I was at Baylor and working with the administration on the economic summit of the early 2000s, a trilateral conference between the USA, Mexico, and Canada, and on the Bush Library. Meeting Karl Rove and all of those experiences was one of the greatest highlights. I think he is the most astute observer of American political processes and policies to be found anywhere today. So therefore, I'm hereby offering him publicly a job as Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Government. And the deal is this. Look, Karl, you can still travel, speak, and then come back to Houston occasionally to teach for us. The financial details should be very easy to work out, given the fact that you can now be paid for your lectures since you're not in a government position. So that offer is on the table. We'll see if he responds at all to it tonight, but we are thrilled, of course, to have Karl Rove here. I want to bring out for you now Charles Baccaris. He is our Vice President for Advancement. Charles is a good friend of our special guest and will introduce Mr. Rove to us. Charles works directly with our alumni and many university friends in building relationships across the community. Mr. Baccaris brings to HBU an extensive background in government service, including 4 consecutive terms as Harris County District Clerk. In that role, he transformed the 4th largest county agency using a very results-oriented, customer-driven model of efficiency and effectiveness. Prior to that, Charles Baccaris worked in the White House as the Associate Director of President Reagan's Office of Media Relations and the Assistant Director of the Office of Public Liaison for President George H.W. Bush. Away from HBU, his community service includes being appointed by Governor Perry to chair the Texas Department of Information Resources Board. Charles Baccaris, please come now and introduce our special guest, Mr. Karl Rove.
Thank you, Dr. Sloan, and welcome, everybody. I think Dr. Sloan really covered so much of Karl's background and experience that I'm not going to read the prepared text, but I'm just going to offer you an observance from my personal experience. In 1994, I was a young 31-year-old guy who decided to offer himself for public service, and I ran for Harris County District Clerk. I was on the very bottom of the ballot at the same time that this man named George W. Bush was running for governor. And I had the chance to meet his political consultant, Karl. And at that time, I knew that Karl had helped the Republican Party gain prominence in the state by his successive engineering and campaign management of our Supreme Court justices, and prior to that, Governor Bill Clement's run for governor. So I knew of him before I met him. And what I found was even more than what was written. He is an immensely generous and kind-hearted man who deeply cares about his friends and cares about his state and his country. I was privileged to be able to develop a friendship with Karl over the years that I served as district clerk and he served the governor of Texas. In 1998, after Governor Bush's successful reelection, I had the opportunity to go up to Austin and sit down with Karl, and I said, Karl, I have a sense of where all this is going for you and for Governor Bush, and I want to be part of it. I want to help. And that began a collaboration that has lasted to this day. I'm thankful for his friendship, and I'm thankful for what he did in service to this country and to the president. So, you know, we all know that Karl has many accolades, but the best thing I can say about him is he's a great Texan, he's a great American, and I call him my friend, and I'm blessed to do that. Ladies and gentlemen, Karl Rove.
Thank you. Thank you. Enough. Sooner you stop clapping, the sooner I finish talking, and the sooner we get to your questions. Thank you, Charles, for that very kind introduction. I wish you hadn't said that I was a good friend and warm and friendly, and I've worked so hard for the Darth Vader image. And, you know, it really chaps me when Cheney says he's Darth Vader. Everybody knows I am, and he's the Sith Lord. I mean, come on. Look, here's what I thought I'd do. I thought I'd talk a little bit about my new book, shamelessly promoting it, and then save all of the big political issues and current controversies for the Q&A, because we got some great questions, I understand. They've not showed them to me, but they told me they cover the range, and I'm sure Charles will make certain we cover the range. But I thought I'd maybe talk just a little bit about the book and then get into your Q&A. I wrote the book because I ended up someplace that I never really expected in my life to be. You know, I've always loved politics. I've always been involved in politics from my earliest days. My first political experience was doing a very important task on behalf of Nixon for president, and that was to put the bumper sticker on my wire basket of my bicycle and ride up and down the street. This was critical to his election. You may not have been aware of that. But I ended up officing 15 feet from the Oval Office, and I was there a long time. The average tenure of a White House senior aide is about 18 months, and I was there for about 7 years, as were a lot of people who worked for Bush. They were there a long time because of the place it was and the times we found ourselves in and the kind of environment that he created that made it possible for you to live inside a whirlwind or drink from a fire hose 24 hours a day. You pick the right metaphor. But I saw things that I wanted people to understand. So in the book, I try and draw back the curtain and let people get a sense of what it was like during those consequential years inside the White House. I'm, for example, the guy that at 8:48 a.m. on a bright September morning walked over to the president and said, "Mr. President, a plane has flown into the World Trade Center. We don't know whether it's private or public, jet or prop." I spent 9/11 with him. And it changed me. I suspect it changed you too. I bet you can remember exactly when you heard the first news. I bet you remember being riveted to the television. You know, wherever the president travels, any president travels, there's a room nearby wherever the event that he's participating in that's called the staff hold. And it's the, sort of a nondescript room nearby. And it's where the president's senior staff, the guy with the football, the surgeon, the doctor with the surgical kit, and the nurse, and the senior staff of the president hang out while the president's doing whatever he's doing. And generally there's a television set in there, and there are always special telephones. They're brought by the military, the White House Communications Office the day before and installed and guarded 24 hours a day. And shortly after the president departs the venue, somebody comes in, unplugs these units, boxes them up, and they're put on a military transport. I spent the opening moments of the global war on terror in the staff hold, stealing a television set, because there was no television that day in the staff hold. So I had to get one in this elementary school, on one of those big sort of dollies, and it has the television on the top. So I then plugged it in. I plugged it in, but it was a cable TV. So when I plugged it in, it just had snow on the picture. And I had to take the cable, and I'm literally crawling around on the floor trying to figure out which one of the 3 cable outlets is the right one. And I didn't pick the first one right. But the second one, I think it was the second one, I plugged it in. And I remember distinctly the television popped. It went, and the picture came on. And the second plane was flying into the World Trade Center. You remember the famous photograph of Andy Carr, the chief of staff, going in and whispering in the president's ear? I remember what happened a few minutes later. The president waited until they finished this reading demonstration. He didn't think it was exactly the right thing to do with a bunch of third and fourth graders to stand up and run out of the room. And he knew that this reading demonstration was coming to a close, so he waited a few minutes, and then when it ended, he excused himself and came into the staff hold. And when he did, they were playing the footage a second time. And it was the slow motion one where they showed just before the plane hits the tower, he turns his wings to take out a maximum number of floors. I've known Bush a long time, and so I can read his moods, and there was a weird mood that day because it was very calm and very cool, but there was steel in it, and he said, I'll never forget, it was like this morning, he said, "We're at war, give me the director of the FBI and the vice president." And we got on those funny phones and started dialing people up. I was by his side virtually the rest of the day. A few minutes later, the Secret Service got us to leave. They said, we need to move, Mr. President. His public whereabouts were known, and they were afraid that there would be an effort to decapitate the government. These fears got worse during the day because, look, some nut called up Secret Service or called up the White House and said, after the first plane flew in, and said, we're going to get the president next, and we're going to take out Air Force One. And as this threat got passed up the line of the chain of command, somebody invoked the secret code word for the then secret code word for Air Force One, which was Angel. And they said, so they, threat had been on the president, and the fact that somebody had seemingly invoked the secret code word for Air Force One gave it greater credibility. So they were really nervous. And being Secret Service, they displayed their nervousness by being absolutely not nervous appearing at all. These guys were just cold, stone, silent, solid, training kicked in, but they wanted him to move and move quickly. So we got in the limo and headed to the airport, the motorcade. Now, a presidential motorcade goes generally pretty fast, but we made, I think it's about 5 miles in just over 4 minutes, and we were moving. And I remember the president got a phone call about the strike on the Pentagon while we're sitting in the limo on the way to the airport, and he was talking on the phone, though I could only hear one side of the conversation. But I remember looking out the window of the limousine, and it looked like we're surrounded by a sea of police cars because they had mobilized every Sarasota police car to get us to the airport. And so we were surrounded, literally moving as fast as you could, surrounded by police cars. It was pretty amazing. We got to the airport. You've all seen a presidential arrival or departure. The president walks up the stairs by himself, gets to the top, turns around, waves to the crowd. Now, sometimes there's no crowd. In fact, there's always TV cameras, but there's sometimes no crowd. But you got to wave anyway. Hello, Well, he was moving up the stairs, and I was at the bottom of the stairs waiting for him to get to the top and disappear into the plane before I moved up. That was the protocol. And I was standing next to Eddie Morenzo, the Secret Service detail head. And Eddie looked at me. I could tell something was cackling in his earpiece, and he looked at me and he said, move. Didn't yell, didn't scream, just said move. And I moved. Started moving up the stairs, as did everybody else, just as quick as we could. I got up about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way up the stairs. I happened to glance to my right, and underneath the wingtip, they had made the press drop all of their press equipment, cameras and sound booms and everything else, and they had a bomb dog going over because they were afraid somebody was trying to sneak a bomb onto Air Force One. We got into Air Force One. When you walk on Air Force One, if you turn left, very few people turn left. You go into the president's bedroom and bathroom and shower. So everybody turns right. The first door on your left is the president's cabin. The next one is the medical unit, and then there's the galley, and then there's the place I was going, which was the senior staff cabinet. 4 very nice chairs and pull-down desks from the wall, and it's where the senior guys hang out. But as I walked by the president's office, he went like this and motioned to the chair across the table from him. I sat down, and not too much longer, everybody else had piled on the plane, and the plane began to move almost immediately. I remember looking out the president's door and towards the door of Air Force One, and normally what happened is some guy would come in and they'd close the door to Air Force One, and then they'd pull back the stairs. Well, I'm looking through the open door, and all of a sudden the stairs disappear. They just are gone. It's like the guy on the truck, put it in reverse and floored it because the plane is already starting to move, and if he doesn't move that truck, the wing is going to hit his stairs. So the guy just whips it out of there, and the door is still open. Air Force One is moving, and the door is not buttoned up. An airman comes up, holds onto a strap, leans out over the open concrete as nothing between him and the concrete except air, and he reaches out and grabs the door of Air Force One in order to close it and button it up. And we're moving. We get to the end of the runway, and Colonel Tillman flips the back tail around like we were in a Cessna. You ever been in a small plane on a runway and you like that? Well, this 747 flips it around like that. And I remember he stomped on the brakes and turned up the engines as loud as I've ever heard them on Air Force One, and then let her go, and we just rocketed down that runway. I've been on aircraft carrier landings and takeoffs, and it was like a takeoff. We just went, because they were worried. They thought some guy might be lurking nearby with a shoulder-launched surface-to-air missile, and they wanted to get that bird up as quick as they could. They got it off the runway, and rather than sort of making the normal ascent, they just sort of stood it on its tail. I remember sitting in my chair looking like this. It was a weird feeling being in a big bird like that. Almost from the beginning, the president said, I want to go back to Washington. And they said, Mr. President, we can't guarantee the airspace in Washington, the quality, the security. Both Secret Service and the Pentagon. They said, Mr. President, you can't come back here. We don't know what we don't know. And we can't guarantee your safety. They told us that they needed to put more fuel on the plane because we only had the fuel load enough to get us back to Washington. They said, Mr. President, we need to get you to a secure installation in order to load the plane up so if we need to, we can keep you airborne for 18 hours. And we also need to offload unessential personnel to make it easier. And the nearest installation to do this was Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport because, ironically enough, by accident, Barksdale was doing a nuclear test drill for it's the headquarters of the 8th Air Force, and they were doing a drill that day, and they'd already buttoned themselves up the day before, and they were at the top level of security, so the entire base was already secure. So we fly into Barksdale. Of course, nobody knows where we are, except as we're approaching Barksdale on final approach, we turn on the local TV, and some local enterprising news director has put a camera at the end of the approach to Barksdale, and so we're watching ourselves landing at Barksdale on local TV. So much for the secret. Hey, here we are. Come and get us. You know, when a president arrives at a military base, it's a great moment. I mean, they have their dress uniforms on. There are flags flying. There are bands. There are people smartly saluting. And I mean, it's pretty impressive. We got off the plane at Barksdale and walked down the stairs to be met by the command structure of the 8th Air Force in combat uniforms with sidearms. You remember how it's sort of weird days, you remember weird things? I remember that the president got into a sort of powder blue Dodge Caravan minivan to ride to the headquarters, not exactly sort of the presidential limo. There was an armed Humvee right behind it with a .50 caliber machine gun on top, and the airman put a live round into the chamber. You could just, I mean, he clicked it. You could hear it. One reporter who was with us lost it when that happened. Completely just came apart. He's now the press secretary for Vice President Joe Biden. I don't know, those 4 words, Vice President Joe Biden, those almost make me come apart. Anyway, finally, the president finally said, I'm going back. He said, I'm coming to Washington. And they said, Mr. President, we can't guarantee the safety of the airspace. He said, I don't care. He says, I have confidence in you. Do your best. He says, but the country wants to see me speak from the Oval Office, and I want to sleep in my own bed tonight, which was sort of a jocular way of ending an argument. I've known him a long time. He was pretty irritated by that point. So we flew back to Washington. We came into what's called the National Capital Airspace, which is the airspace around Washington, D.C. There are special rules, even in peacetime, as to what you can and cannot do in that airspace. And we picked it up over West Virginia. And when we did, I happened to be looking out the left side of the plane, and plowed out of nowhere an F-16, just sort of, and it was there at our wingtip. And I mean at the wingtip. This guy was so close. He was parked maybe 4 or 5 feet off the wingtip of Air Force One, and you could look out there, and I could make out his features. And one of my colleagues said, hey, do you have your camera? That's really amazing. Can you take a picture? So I went back into the president's office to get my camera out of my briefcase, and off the right-hand wing, there was a similarly parked F-16. And it was pretty amazing. I mean, you're in this big bird, and there are these 2 jets right at your wingtip, and it's pretty impressive. And it was sort of stirring for a moment or two, and then you realized why these guys were there. This was no ceremonial escort. These guys were the last line of defense for Air Force One. If something got through the outer defenses, these 2 pilots had been instructed to put their bird between that threat and Air Force One. It was pretty sobering. We got into Andrews. You know, it was not the normal descent. We sort of went like, they were in a 747, and Colonel Tillman sort of aimed it to the ground, and then at the last minute pulls it out and pancakes it onto the runway. That is one really good pilot, incidentally. In Marine, we got off and got into Marine One. Now, before 9/11, we would lift off from Andrews, and wherever the president moves in Marine One, there are 3, they call them white toppers, 3 Sikorsky helicopters that look alike. And they take off at the same time, and they engage in an aerial ballet, sort of like a shell game, so you can't really figure out which one of these has got the president. They're called Marine 1 and then Nighthawk 2 and Nighthawk 3. Or Nighthawk 1 and Nighthawk 2, excuse me. But they're going like this, and so you can't pick them out. And they go about 600, 800, 1,200 feet, and you got a nice sort of, maybe 2,000 feet. You got a nice sort of, you maneuver into Washington, D.C., and you get this nice view of the mall and the Capitol and so forth. It's a sort of leisurely thing. That day we got into Marine One, and it lifted about 5 feet off of the ground, and they made no attempt to do the soft aerial ballet. They moved just as quick as they could. And we came screaming in at treetop level. And they hugged the ground all the way into Washington. I remember looking out the craft to the right-hand side, and there was an apartment building. And the left-hand side, there were houses, and we were looking up at them because we're in a valley, just shooting down this valley. We'd come up over the ridge line, and we'd go like this and over the top of the trees and down. We come over the last ridge line before the Potomac River and came up and over like this and headed straight down, and it looked like we were going to go into the water. And we got about 4 feet off of the deck, and he flattened it out, and then he made a hard right turn. And as he did, the Pentagon came into view with smoke pouring out of it. And nobody had said a single word until that moment. And then the president said the only word spoken on the chopper that day. He said, "Take a look. You're looking at the face of war in the 21st century." And with that, we screamed in over the South Mall and came up and over the trees and onto the South Lawn. So in the book, I wanted to use the vantage point I had to, let people know what happened. Sometimes it was events like that, or the event in 9/14 in New York City with the iconic moment on top of the collapsed fire truck with the bullhorn. Sometimes they're controversies. I've talked about because look, these were controversial times we found ourselves in, whether it was before 9/11 with tax cuts and stem cells, or after 9/11 with a war in Afghanistan and a war in Iraq and the Patriot Act, and or domestic controversy afterwards. And I wanted people to get a vantage point, because if you depend upon the New York Times and the Washington Post for contemporary history, they're just going to get it wrong. They just are. And so I wanted to take the vantage point and to write things from a direct and frank and candid way, what we got right and what we got wrong, and why we did the things we did. And look, we did get things wrong. Not the big things, but we got things wrong. And sometimes the things we got wrong involved controversies. Chapter 21, July 15, 2003. Ted Kennedy gives a speech saying Bush lied about WMD in Iraq. Later that day, Tom Daschle holds a news conference and says Bush lied about WMD in Iraq. The next day, John Kerry, in a speech, and John Edwards, both of them running for president, in a committee hearing, said Bush lied about WMD. And the day ended with a statement issued by Jane Harman saying Bush lied about WMD. This began a 2-year-long effort to say that Bush lied about WMD. And it was cynical, and it was hypocritical. And it was started by Ted Kennedy, a guy whom I had some respect for. I didn't agree with his politics, but he worked at his job. You had a meeting with Ted Kennedy, I don't care how unimportant the issue was, you better bring your A game, because he was bringing his. You better have thought through where you were, where he might be, what your response might be to what he said, and you better study the issue from top to bottom and be ready, because I don't care what the issue was, he was ready. And if you weren't ready, you'd walk out with not just your wallet, but your trousers as well. But what he did that day was one of the worst things to happen in American politics, because he knew he was saying a lie. Because all 5 of those people, and you don't have 5 big dogs like that say something like that unless they've coordinated it in advance. But all 5 of those people, Kennedy, Daschle, Kerry, Edwards, and Harman, every one of them had said Saddam has WMD. If Bush lied, then they lied. They looked at the same national intelligence estimate he did and came to the same conclusion. Even Kennedy, who opposed the use of force resolution, nonetheless said Saddam has WMD and represents a threat to the region and represents a threat to the United States, but we should use something other than force to constrain his behavior and remove him. Of the 110 Democrats who voted for the Iraq War resolution, 67 of them stood up on the floor of the House or Senate and said Saddam has WMD. And some of them that said that were among the loudest voices denouncing Bush later. Bob Graham, there's a special place in political purgatory for him. Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee writes a letter to Bush saying Saddam has WMD. He represents a grave threat to us. You must act sooner rather than later to remove him from power. Signed by Graham and Republicans and Democrats on his committee. He voted for the war resolution. A year later, he says Bush ought to be impeached because Bush said Sodom had WMD. Well, Bush needed to be impeached for it. What about the senator from Florida? The whole purpose of this was to corrode the public's confidence in the commander-in-chief in a time of war in order to defeat him in the 2004 election. And the mistake we made was not responding. The mistake we made was not standing up with the president himself saying, whoa, wait a minute. Before we go any further, let's be clear. You said he had WMD as well. And instead, inside the White House, we talked about it, and it was like, well, don't wrestle with a pig, you'll get muddy. Or, you know what, let's not relitigate the past. So let's stay focused on the future. And it was my mistake, because I should have said, this is a dagger aimed at the heart of the Bush presidency, and we must respond, and respond forcefully. Because when they started to say it, less than 1 out of every 3 Americans thought it was true. When they finished 2 years later, 2 out of every 3 Americans thought it was true. And it hurt us. We survived the election, but it hurt Bush's ability to govern. And it was cynical and hypocritical. So I write about things like that in the book. I try and be candid. Look, it's 521 pages, I admit. But it's a quick read. Then I put footnotes in there. You don't have to read the footnotes unless you're obsessive like me, but I wanted people, if they disagreed with me, to know where I was coming from, to know my evidence, to know where this came from. And look, it's a good read, it's a fast read, I should say. I'll let you decide whether it's good or not. It's good. I hope you think it's good, because I tried to write about what life was like inside the White House. I tried to give people a sense of who it was that we worked for and how we worked. Because, look, it was amazing that we lasted as long as we did, people like me. Because it's a terrible existence. It's a great job, but it is brutal. I almost didn't go. I write about that in the book. Because, look, I'm pretty good at campaigns. I'm really lousy at internecine warfare. And I remember people telling me, friends who'd worked in Carter, Clinton, Reagan, Ford, Nixon, Senior Bush, they'd say it'd be the greatest job you'll ever have. It'll be the worst. Because you'll say something in a meeting, and somebody who disagrees with you will leak it to the Washington Post or the New York Times in a way that makes you look stupid. And they're big egos and sharp knives, and I'm not good in that kind of place. But Bush understood that and said, I'm not going to make it that way. I'm going to do everything I can to make this a place in which people can walk into the Oval Office and tell me exactly what they believe, and do so with respect and dignity for their colleagues and for me, and at the end of the day be convinced that whatever decision we make, we made the right decision. And that was difficult to do, but important to do. Because, look, that is a place that can really constrain behavior. I'd have guys sitting in my office saying, by God, the administration is screwing this up, and by God, the president needs to know Secretary so-and-so is an idiot, and by God, the administration needs to get in line and do this and do that, and by God, the president needs to hear from me, and by God, he's not. I'd say, great, let's go tell him. Let's go see him. And we'd walk into the Oval Office, and they'd take one look around and say, hey, Mr. President, you're looking pretty today. How's everything? How's Barney? Vladimir Putin comes to the White House for the first time. Remember, this is a KGB guy. He's about this tall, and he's like a thug. He's sort of like Tony Soprano without Soprano's charm. I mean, he's a one mean little guy. KGB guy, raised in the official atheistic Soviet Union, comes to the White House, comes to Washington for his first visit, walks into the Oval Office. There's the fantastic HMS Resolute desk given to us by Queen Victoria, used by every president, virtually every president since Rutherford B. Hayes. There's the Gilbert Stewart hanging over the fireplace. There's the president's paintings of Texas. There's that fantastic rug with oak leaves and bright yellow colors and cream colors. And there's those huge, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out on the south lawn and the rose garden, and the light is streaming through, and there's the flag of the United States and the flag of the presidency. Vladimir Putin takes one look around, first 3 words, oh my God. That's how powerful the office is. And it really can be formidable and isolate a president. So Bush tried to make it so that people could say what they felt no matter whether they thought he'd agree with it or not. Look, he didn't keep me around for my pretty face. He just didn't. Or my athletic ability. Wish I had some. He kept me around because, like many who worked with him, he counted on me to say what I felt, whether I agreed with him or not. July of 2000, Bush is thinking about who's going to be his vice presidential running mate. There are 9 guys we're looking at, and Bush has added a 10th name onto the list as we've gone through this process. He's decided that he likes the guy who's actually running the vetting process, Dick Cheney. And I'm against it. And he knows it. There's 6 people who know this: Bush, Cheney, Laura, Pinky Albaugh, the campaign manager, Karen Hughes, and me. So Bush calls me up. He's flying back into town. He says, meet me at the mansion tomorrow and tell me why not Cheney. So at 10 o'clock, I show up at the governor's mansion. We sit down. I'm pretty close to him, sitting across the other side of the room. It's a very small room, about 5-6 feet apart. He says, okay, lay it out. Why not Cheney? I got 8 reasons, starting with, we don't need to worry about the 3 electoral votes of Wyoming. In the bag. Number 2, Cheney had his first heart attack at 37, and he's been working on perfecting them ever since. Number 3, we've tried to identify you as being your own man, not as being mini-me to your father, and so we're going to go pick the guy who was your father's Secretary of Defense. That's going to look good. We got a problem in the upper Midwest and the Northeast where you're seen as a Texas oilman. Let's double down, pick the guy who's head of Halliburton. Anyway, this is going on. This goes on, and look, as I lay out my reasons, oh yeah, Cheney was a very conservative congressman from a very conservative state 22 years ago. So we'll have to defend all of his votes, like voting against the resolution calling for the release of Nelson Mandela from his island prison. Yeah, that's a really easy one there, Mr. President, Mr. Governor. Anyway, I got my 8 reasons, and this goes on for about a half an hour, 35 minutes. I'm not just laying them out. Bush is contesting me every step of the way. It's like, I think you're exaggerating there, or what if I said this, or what about that making me defend it? This goes on for about 30, 35 minutes. I lay out my 12 reasons. Finally, at the end of it, I sort of have run out of reasons, and Bush has run out of objections, and he says, you got anything else? I said, no, that's about it. He said, good, well done. Turned to the guy next to him and said, Dick, got any questions for Karl? I'm thinking, great. I've just offended the guy who's going to be the next vice president of the United States, and he goes around heavily armed. That, incidentally, was my lawyer he shot. One good lawyer in the state of Texas, and Cheney shoots the son of a bitch. What the heck is that all about? What is that? Next day, Bush called me. He said, you're right. Every one of those is a political problem. Go solve them. He said, your job is politics. My job is something else. He said, my job is to figure out who would be the strongest partner to me in the Oval Office, and if something terrible were to happen to me, whom would the country have confidence in immediately was up to the task. So he said, you go figure out the politics and figure out how to solve all of those reasons, all those problems. He was right. I was looking at it through the lens of, how do I get through this campaign? He's looking at it through the lens of, what do I do once I get into the Oval Office? And he was right and I was wrong. And we solved all those problems. Every one of them came to pass. Cheney health problem. What about Nelson Mandela? You know what's interesting? You know who began to attack Cheney on his voting record 24 hours after he started? The now senior advisor to Barack Obama. So anyway, they've been in my life for a long time. But it was, I wanted people to know how things like that happen. I wanted people to know how things were actually decided. I also wanted to give people a sense of what it was like to actually work in the White House, because look, it is an amazing place. Andy Card told me, he said, the day that you do not feel something special when you walk in the gates is the day to leave. And I left feeling honored to walk in the door, to walk in the gates, to work with those people, extraordinary people who sacrifice so much on behalf of our country. I really admire and love them an enormous amount. And one of the great things about working there was that you got to know people like that, at least in the environment in which we lived. You also, look, it was grim at times. Just had to be during a time of war. I mean, when you begin your day by getting a casualty report, it's a grim place. When you have to every week staff a meeting, every week or two staff a meeting with sometimes multiple families who've lost somebody in Afghanistan or Iraq, it can be painful. But it was also a place of fun and joy. And I sort of was the unofficial mayor of the West Wing, or maybe the unofficial prankster of the West Wing. So I did my best to sort of, at the appropriate times, sort of leaven the atmosphere, you know, raise spirits a little bit. One time I did it by stealing a car. My National Economic Council, the director of the National Economic Council, Al Hubbard, my colleague, very successful business guy from Indiana, and he drove a very, 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 very nice BMW. And like all the senior aides to the president, he parked it on West Executive Drive. Charles knows where that is. It's between the White House and the old EEOB right next door. It's about 150 yards long. Yeah, it's not very long, and it's literally one lane wide, with parking spaces on either side. And now look, in order to park there, you got to be a senior aide to the president, so you don't have car thieves. In order to get there, you got to drive through 3 checkpoints, 3 gates. Your car gets sniffed by a bomb dog. A guy with a weird mirror looks underneath your car, and you drive over some weird device embedded in the pavement that I could never figure out what it was exactly or what it did, but I was constantly afraid that I would sort of be beamed up to the Starship Enterprise when I rolled over it. And then you drive past a final gate and onto West Executive, and your car is guarded by men and women with automatic weapons who know how to use them. You're in the White House, for God's sake. This is the safest place in the world. So Hubbard would park his car and leave his keys. So one day I'm walking back from the EEOB, I'm meeting the EEOB, to my West Wing office, and I've got a few minutes to kill, and I'm walking by Hubbard's car, and I look in, and there are his keys. So I get in the car, and I move it. I drive it up West Executive, and I park it behind the sniffer truck. After 9/11, there was this weird truck that sniffed the air constantly for chemical and biological agents, so we'd have a few minutes to say our final prayers. And I hid it behind the sniffer truck where you couldn't see it. Now, I wasn't there, but when Hubbard came out, I have 2 eyewitnesses who say when Hubbard came out, he's from Jackson, Tennessee originally, so he's got an accent that we can sort of understand down here. He whips out his cell phone, hits the speed dial, calls his assistant, and says, "Dougie, my car is gone. They've stolen my car." This, eventually he found it, of course. But this was so much fun, I did it again. And again. And again. But being the architect, I thought ahead. So what I would do is, before I would steal the car any other time after that, I would get one of my White House colleagues to get in the front seat with me and ride to wherever I parked it. And I would hide it out in the EEOB courtyard. Or one time I put it on the loading dock, Secret Service. "Mr. Hubbard, could you please come move your car? It's inappropriately parked." And Hubbard would just sort of lose it. He'd say, "Would you stop doing that?" I said, "Hubbard, I'm upset that you would accuse me of that. After all, I saw someone else get out of your car, and I'm not going to say who it was." Which was true, of course. I did see somebody else get out of his car. So finally, Hubbard gets me back, however. Last week I'm there. We're flying back from Reno, Nevada on Air Force One, and I turned on the television on Air Force One and to watch the news, and I just flipped through the channels, and as I'm flipping through CNN, there is my car on West Executive Drive with cameras pointed at it. Someone has put Post-it notes of different colors in order to form words on the windows of my car, and then wrapped the entire car in industrial cellophane. Giant plastic sheets. And then it has been festooned with stuffed animals. I have a stuffed eagle and a stuffed chicken and a stuffed bear. And it's on West Executive, and it's on national television, and they're using my name. So I get back to the White House. Hubbard is just full of himself. I called him, I said, "Well done." He said, "What are you talking about, man?" I said, "I saw it. Look, you got me back. I admit it. I've been stealing your car for all this year and a half, and you have done, it's fantastic, man. This is really good. I got the White House photographer, Eric Draper, waiting for us outside. Let's you and me go down, stand next to your handiwork, and you've done it, Bubba. Really well done." So we meet down there, and Hubbard is really full of himself. It's like, and Eric Draper's having a little difficulty with the camera. I don't know, this is having difficulty getting it ready. I don't know what's up. It's sort of like Eric's normally got it. So Hubbard and I are standing there, and he is really taking this moment in. It's really great, exciting for him. And there's cameras up there on the Pebble Beach that took the pictures of. They're still trained on the car. And Hubbard is sort of preening for the cameras that are yards away. And with that, up walk 2 uniformed officers of the Secret Service who proceed to handcuff him. Then Eric Draper takes the photograph. It is one of my favorite mementos of my time in the White House. I'll teach him to put my car in cellophane. Anyway, I hope if you haven't read the book, I hope you will. If you don't, borrow it from your library. You can also get a short version of it on audiobooks. And with that, I'd be happy to answer or duck your questions on topics of the book, or more importantly, of not the book. Thanks for having me here tonight. Oh, one last thing. Sloan, I know you're not going to pay me because you're cheap. But give me a time, and maybe we'll work out a deal for an occasional visit down here for a special seminar. Thanks for having me.
Well done.
Thank you.
Well, that was fantastic. And Karl, I really appreciate those personal stories of what you did with your colleagues and how you were able to keep some sense of normalcy in the midst of the challenges of working at the White House. It is a very intense place, absolutely. We've had a few questions, and let me ask the audience. I know we all sat enraptured and listened to this man, and you've not yet filled out your questions on your card. So please take a moment, write down your question for Karl so we can get them up here and get moving. One thing I want to ask you is kind of back up a little bit and talk about how right after the governor's reelection in 1998, you all began to think about the presidency, the run. And what you all did, you and Governor Bush at the time and your team, you designed this fantastic front porch campaign, if you will, that was rooted in history. Yeah. Would you talk about that a little bit and talk about how you moved towards the decision to run?
We had two problems. One problem was, well, there wasn't problems. These were realities we had to deal with. They weren't problems. They were just the reality, what life was like. He gets reelected in 98, and he can't do anything in the reelection that carries him outside the state. He can't go out. We went in 97, we would go to California, New York, and Illinois, and elsewhere to raise money. But in 98, we were here. And people had a pent-up desire to sort of figure out, did they want to be for him? So starting in 98, in June of 98, we began to bring groups of people to Austin. We said to people, okay, we can't come to where you are, but you can come here. And I sort of stole the idea from the 1896 McKinley campaign, where McKinley is sort of the first modern president. So he was bound by the tradition that he could not barnstorm the country, which is traditional for American presidents. And yet, on the other hand, he wanted to send telegraph a very strong message of who he was and what he was all about. So they hit on the idea of basically bringing delegations to Canton, Ohio, of various kinds of people in order to demonstrate. He said, look, I'm the last of the Civil War generation to be president, and the Republican Party cannot win if it is a party of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So they would bring these delegations of Serbo-Croatian miners from Pennsylvania and Greek fishermen and spongemen from Rhode Island and Finnish timber guys from Minnesota, all on the trains to Canton, Ohio, to meet him so he could make a message about what kind of a president he would be. So I stole the idea and we started bringing groups to Austin to meet with the then governor, and they'd come for lunch. We'd have about 30 of them in a room for lunch, and Bush would come in from the Capitol because he was involved in the legislative session in '99, and in '98 we had, he was there for governor's business while in the campaign trail, and they'd spend a couple hours with him, and he would stand up and just talk and answer questions for 2 hours, and people would go away excited. Now, what's interesting was I could never figure out, and I could never get him. He constantly said at that time that, look, I haven't made up my mind, which is true. I mean, this guy is. Bush is one of these kind of people who, when he makes a decision, he makes a decision. Mm-hmm. So what's interesting is he's got a book coming out in November, which is going to be really good. And in the book, he basically says, acknowledges that he did these meetings in 98 and the early part of 99 before he decided to run, because I sort of set him up and he felt obligated to do them, but he was still of the mind of, look, Rove may be there, but I'm not there. And Rove's opinion doesn't matter, which was right. My opinion didn't matter. He got to make the final decision. But if you look back, the people who came to Austin were the center of the campaign when it came to money raising and political support all around the country. And they did amazing things, particularly on the political side. We had one guy who since died named Colin McMillan, who came to Austin for one of these meetings, and the day or two later called me back and said, you know what, he was from New Mexico. He said, I was really excited. And he said, I was really excited by the meeting, and I think I could get most of the legislators in New Mexico to endorse Bush. I said, what would it take? He said, it would take me going to Santa Fe, finding a day to go to Santa Fe. I said, you can go to Santa Fe tomorrow. And he went up to Santa Fe and literally 24 hours later had a letter signed by virtually every member of the New Mexico legislature. It was the first such state to do it. And literally within a matter of weeks, we had legislatures around the country. South Carolina, the speaker, David Wilkins, Jim Brulte, whom you know out in California, organized it out there. And literally we had within a matter of weeks, in a huge grassroots effort, all these legislators signing letters saying if Bush runs, we're for him for president. And it was a sign of what, sort of the energy that came out of these meetings.
It was tremendous. It really was. I want to get to a question from the audience, and this is interesting. What would you say is the number one difference between President Bush and the current president? What's the number one difference in your mind?
One is a conservative and one is not.
Very good.
Yeah. I will say this, I will try and find a way to say something positive about our president, because I do respect the office of the presidency, even if I disagree with the president.
Right.
But I don't want to sound too hypercritical, but it really caught my ear the way he handled the stimulus package. In December of '08, he sends Geithner and Summers up to Capitol Hill to say to the Congress, we need to have a stimulus package, and we did need to stimulate the economy. They said $650 to $750. But we'll take up to $850. Well, you don't give Congress a range of numbers like $650 to $750, but we'll take up to $850 without having them go for $850. In fact, you may remember the Senate bill that they were considering was $880 billion until three renegade Republicans said, if you want our vote, you got to cut $100 billion off of spending, and then you got to swap another $100 billion of spending for the AMT fix. So the first thing that got me was he was telegraphing in Congress, you can roll me. The second thing was, when they described what they wanted in the package, it was only about $160 or $170 billion. You don't tell Congress, here's this big thing, but you go write it. Outsourcing to Congress inevitably ends up in a bad place. And that's why we didn't have a stimulus bill that worked. Because Dave Obey, who's announced his retirement today, the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, reached into his bottom drawer and picked out every bad spending idea that hadn't been able to get approved for 40 years and stuffed in the bill. Look, in the stimulus bill, there's $5 billion for smoking cessation and obesity counseling. What the heck does that have to do with stimulating the economy? So it's pure spending. The other thing that got me was they sent them up to the Hill. Remember, we're not red states, blue states, but we're United States.
Right.
They sent them up to the Hill and had them only meet with Democrats. I later had dinner with a senior member of the Obama economic team who said to me months later, geez, I was really surprised that the House Republicans in particular were so anti-stimulus. And I said, well, let me ask you, did you ever meet with them? He said, no. I said, would you ever sit down and have a dialogue about what you could incorporate? Did any member of the administration sit down with the Republican leadership and say, what could we incorporate of your ideas into our bill? And he said, well, no. And I said, well, then why would you expect them to be for the bill? I said, frankly, if you'd done that, you could have gotten 30 or 40% of the House Republicans and set a much different tone than everything that came afterwards. And in a way, we're sort of fortunate that they didn't. It was a self-inflicted wound on their part.
Very true. Another friend here asks, can you discuss the Arizona immigration law and the potential implications for the Republican Party nationally, and how will it affect our midterm elections in 2010?
Let me take the political part first, and then I'll take the policy part. The political part is, in the short run, this will be a plus for us. Because in the short run, It will affect people in the off-year elections by causing them to be ramped up. Because the fundamental issue is going to be, do you believe that people who are here illegally, or do you think that we ought to turn a blind eye to it? And these rallies that are being held around the country are basically saying, turn a blind eye to it. Over the long haul, it's more problematic because a lot of people, particularly in the Latino community, can look at this and say, you don't like people who look like me. Now, that's not what the law is going to do. I've actually read the bill. You ought to read the bill, incidentally. It's online. It's only 16 pages, and there are lots of white space.
Wow.
I mean, not only that, but it's in English. You know, simple, easy to understand, monosyllabic words. I mean, it's well done. Because in there it says, for example, you cannot use someone's race or ethnicity in order to question them about their immigration status. It says you can't do that. So the idea that look, all these sort of hyperventilating left-wingers are out there hyperventilating, I think, in order to sort of whip up Latino sentiment against the Republican Party. And we got to be careful about that long term.
Right.
Now, the policy of the bill, I've got unfortunately a nuanced view. I'm supposed to be on Fox, so I'm not supposed to have nuance, but I'm an Episcopalian, so I'm nuanced. I'm sorry. I understand why Arizona did this. The border is a lot tougher for people to get across. 15 years ago, you could hire a coyote in northern Mexico for $150 to get you across the border. Today, it's $2,500, and it's not because they're providing more amenities. It's just a lot tougher.
Right.
But paradoxically, what that means is the tougher the border becomes, the more dangerous the weak points of the border are. Because look, if you're sitting down there in Mexico and you're saying, look, I'm trying to get up to the United States, to the Estados Unidos, in order to get a job, changing beds in Las Vegas or picking onions in Uvalde or going up to, Kennesaw, Kennewick, Washington to pick fruit, you don't have $2,500 to pay somebody. And the risk-reward ratio is a lot different. But if you're a drug runner, some guy bringing drugs north and money and guns south, you still want to get across the border. That's why in Arizona they had this brutal murder at a ranch in an isolated part of the border.
Right.
And they feel compelled to do something about it. But look, the bill is very carefully drawn. So it creates no new cause of action for people to ask somebody about their immigration status. You can only ask them if you picked them up on some other reason. They were driving erratically, they're driving drunk, the guy tried to knock over the 7-Eleven, he's drunk and disorderly. Some other reason that you can find to pick the guy up, and then you're allowed to ask it. And even then it's constrained. If the guy shows you a driver's license from Arizona or one of 42 other states that asks citizenship as part of that, the presumption is they're a U.S. citizen and you got to stop. Well, we got a lot of states where you can still duplicate the driver's licenses. Counterfeit driver's licenses are a real problem. Mm-hmm. So some guy could have a counterfeit license. Anyway, I'm dialoguing with some people in Arizona over the internet over emails about this. But here's my concern about it. At the end of the day, I don't think this is going to solve the problem. It may create a predisposition among illegals that, hey, I got to get out of here, and that's probably healthy. But I think the biggest problem is going to be the expectations are that it's going to make it safe, much safer, and it's not. I would much rather that states focus on what's called 287G. Mm-hmm. This is a law signed by Clinton in 1996 that says the federal government will take local law enforcement officers and train them and authorize them to act as immigration enforcement, which means there's a lower standard, lower than the Arizona law. Now, the problem is Obama administration does not seem to be too excited about having 287G authority. I also worry that they've stopped building the fence in Arizona. Mm-hmm. We don't need a fence all along the border, but we need it in certain areas, and for them to have said, you know what, for reasons of whatever, budget or tone, fear of offending Mexico, we're not going to continue to build out the fence as Congress authorized and Bush signed, is a problem.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I think we would be better off, all of us, if we lowered the temperature. I saw today, Megyn Kelly, my colleague at Fox, had this council member on in Oakland who claimed to have read the bill, but she was reading them the bill, which was in direct contravention to what the guy said. And that's a lot of what this is about. It is about posturing and politics.
Absolutely.
And if this had happened next year, or if it had happened last year, the tone would be a lot different because nobody would be trying to make it into an issue for the fall.
Absolutely. Let's turn to foreign affairs, even though that is a great segue into the subject.
it seems that the United States has, I'm being charitable here, lost our ability to project strength. Certainly we can talk about what we've just done at the UN with Ahmadinejad and telling him exactly how many nuclear warheads we had. And there are many other instances of our ability to show weakness, even in the way in which we have decided to move these terrorists through the civil justice system rather than military tribunals. Where is this going to go? And would you be surprised if Israel acts aggressively, perhaps unilaterally, to try to nip this threat of a nuclear Iran in the bud?
Yeah, look, let's give him credit. He's doing the right thing in Iraq.
Right.
The president's doing the right thing in Afghanistan, though it's a little weird in Afghanistan because it took 3 months for him to decide to surge. You don't need 8 meetings in the sit room where you release photographs from each meeting to show that you're thoughtful. And he also did something weird in it. Look, today, ironically enough, is the day at which half the troops in the surge have now arrived in Afghanistan. The rest of them will arrive by August. And then 11 months after that, he will begin to withdraw them. Now, we may need to keep them there longer than that. And we should, because it's absolutely vital that we win. But I do worry about the sense of weakness. I mean, we are beating up on our friends like Netanyahu and the Israelis when we are, sort of romancing, Chavez, Castro, and Ahmadinejad. I mean, they say ugly things about our best ally in the region that they would not ever consider saying about our adversaries anywhere. And I worry about that because it sends the wrong signal. Iran is a very difficult and complex problem. We played our best card in 1979, and it's going to be I wouldn't be surprised if Israel didn't take some unilateral action. But remember, the time goes on and people observe. And the Iranians observed what the Israelis did in Erbil in Iraq and in Syria and said, hey, let's not make those same mistakes. The Syrians and the Iraqis put their facilities all in one place. So let's disperse our facilities throughout the country. In both attacks in Syria and Iraq, the facilities were taken out using conventional weapons because the facilities were above ground. So let's get some smart German engineers in here, and we will design our program and our buildings so they're deep underground beyond the reach of what we think are the conventional weapon stocks available to the U.S. and Israel. Now, we tried to sort of signal something differently to them. In early 2007, the Bush administration asked Congress to approve funds to upgrade our conventional weapons, the bunker busters. And the object there was to upgrade them so that the Iranians would have a sense of, well, wait a minute, we designed these knowing what we knew, but what do we not know now? Maybe we better deal because they can take this stuff out. And the newly elected Democrat Congress turned us down. And the Iranians read it for what it was, which was a sign of a lack of resolve on the part of the Congress.
Absolutely. Going back to domestic politics now just for a moment, and particularly the ability for the Republican Party to grow. What suggestions do you have for attracting African Americans, Hispanics, and other minorities into our party, into the Republican Party? How can we best do that?
Well, first of all, we got to go make the argument in their communities. You can't win the argument if you don't make the argument. I've always been amazed by this study that was done in Kansas City after the 2000 election. This fellow who's now since passed, he was a relatively young man and died unexpectedly of a heart attack, but he was sort of insanely focused on this issue. And he did a study in Kansas City after the election, and what he did is he said, okay, let's assume that the African American and white populations in the Kansas City area watch television the same amount. So they saw roughly equal amounts of television ads. They read the newspaper roughly, they read the Kansas City Star, so they saw this roughly the same amount of coverage. But he said radio is highly differentiated by race. You listen to urban broadcasting, you're black. You listen to country, you tend to be white. And so he said, let's take a look at the radio stations and their viewership and divide them up by those that are predominantly white and those that are predominantly black, and then those that are sort of roughly in the middle we'll ignore for the time being. And we'll add up how many messages, i.e. ads, each side had. How many pro-Gore, pro-Democrat, anti-Bush, anti-Republican versus pro-Bush, pro-Republican, anti-Gore, anti-Democrat. And he looked at African-American radio. There were something like 16,000 messages that were pro-Gore, pro-Democrat, anti-Republican, anti-Bush. There were 6 that were anti-Gore. And I don't mean 6,000, I mean 6. 6 ads on the other side, pro-Bush, pro-Republican. And his point was, how can we win if everybody's got equal information coming from this, but everybody on radio gives a big benefit to the Democrats. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go make the argument in the community. And maybe that means we campaign aggressively in the community. It means we probably have to have well-organized presence inside our campaign. In the 2004 campaign, we bought a lot of radio in battleground states on African American and religious stations. And as a result, in Ohio, for example, our percentage of the African American vote doubled between 2000 and 2004. Doubled. Now, it was still an anemic 16% to 18%, depending on what state it is, but it was better than getting 8 or 9. The other thing is we've got to support candidates from those communities who are running for office, particularly candidates from those communities in white districts. We used to get in this habit of saying, okay, that's a Latino district, we got no chance in hell of winning. Nominate a Latino. That's an African American district, overwhelmingly Democrat, we can't win that, nominate an African American. That's why it was so important in 1998 when Bush ran for re-election in Texas, that of the 28 statewide elected officials, I think we had 18 or so up that year on the ballot, the majority of them were not white men.
That's right.
We had African Americans, Latinos, women, and they were the majority of the ticket. And that's why, for example, we've got this wonderful woman running in Dallas for the State House as a Republican in a white district, overwhelmingly white district, named Carson, who is an articulate, smart, outgoing, energetic, fantastic Republican African-American candidate. And that's important because that sends a strong message that we're inclusive and welcoming of everybody, and it's not an issue of tokenism.
You've got Alan West in Florida.
Yeah, Alan West in Florida, and there's a great candidate, Tim Scott, who's running in the 1st District in South Carolina, and I mean, this would be really important for us to win.
Good, good. Here's a great one, and I appreciate it. Do you have any advice for young people hoping to run for office in the next few years?
Yeah, don't focus so much on it. First of all, get your degree. Take every writing class and communications class you can take. Second of all, figure out what you want to do in life besides politics. I had a great friend in college, Republicans, named Don Schroeder. He's a professor now in North Carolina. He said, your ability to be effective in politics is in a direct relationship to your ability to say no. And your ability to say no is in an inverse relationship to the amount of money you need to derive from politics. So go figure out what it is you want to do in life besides politics. Then figure out where you want to do it, and then go start doing it in a way where you can provide for your family. And then be active in your community and look for the opportunity to run. People who say, well, you know what, I'm going to run for office when I'm going to run for the state house when I'm 24, and then I'm going to get elected to the state senate at 28, and I'm going to run for Congress when I'm 32. Life just doesn't work out that way. And people are going to find themselves enormously disappointed if they don't say, you know what, I'm going to have a wonderful life, and I'm going to have a wonderful family, and I'm going to pursue a career in a profession or a line of work that is my passion. And incidentally, I'm going to find time for and look for the opportunity to do something in politics. And I'm going to live in a place where I want to be.
Right.
I came back to Texas when I was a young man. I went to Washington when I was 20 years old. And I came to Texas when I was 25. If I'd stayed in Washington, there would be a dime a dozen. I mean, I'd be legislative. I'd be the chief of staff.
You're all over Capitol Hill.
I'd be living on Capitol Hill, and I'd have a nice townhome, and I'd be the chief of staff to Congressman so-and-so, or chief of staff to Senator what, or the chief clerk on committee so-and-so. And I could have had the experiences I had here in Texas. And so, go to Washington maybe for a little while to experience it, but come back and live where you want to live.
Good. And to follow up with that, what are your future aspirations? Are you going to leave politics, or what are you going to do?
First of all, I'm very interested in this person. Raise your hand. Where are you? You've got a Ronald Reagan doodled. Is he here tonight? I mean, this is
right. Well, I don't know, Carl.
I don't know. Incidentally, I went to the ranch last Friday. Ronald Reagan's ranch. Is anybody who's been there? Raise your hand if you have been.
Some folks have.
You ought to try and go. Wasn't it extraordinary? Yeah, it was mind blowing. First of all, it is incredibly beautiful. It's up about 2,400 feet above sea level, up in the mountains, and literally you drive up on this sort of, back and forth like this. It's sort of, I got a mild fear of heights, and I keep looking and going to. But you get up there, and you come over this ridge, and you come up into the property, and it's like in this little saddle between two peaks with a lake down there and this house, and horses running wild out there, and it is spectacular. And then you go into the house, and I got to tell you, I walked out of there, first of all, with a much different view of Nancy Reagan. Nancy Reagan strikes me as, sort of, designer outfits and unbelievable taste, and, everything that I've seen about her is just elegant. And you go into this house, and this is a very modest house with very modest furnishings, and his favorite Western sort of chintzy art on the walls. Their bed is two twin beds tied together by a cable. Seriously. And at the bottom, and she came up and literally made the bed herself so that it would be exactly the way it was when they were there. At the bottom of his side of the bed is a stool because the bed is too short and his feet lopped off the bottom of the bed. So a little stool there. But I mean, it's like this weird sort of, you've seen it, it's sort of this weird sort of Western art. And this was his very private preserve.
That's right.
His senior aides traveled with him, but this was where he was. And it's very small. The thing has got to be smaller than this stage. It has no central air, no central heat. It has two fireplaces. I mean, the bathroom is like 1947 in your grandparents' house, in desperate need of being updated. And this was where he found comfort. Right. They would have Thanksgiving there every year when he was in the White House. They would put a piece of plywood on top of the pool table, a mini pool table, not a full-size pool table, but a mini pool table. Put a piece of plywood on it and a linen, and that was their table where he'd carve the turkey. Ed Meese, a couple of years ago, visited it. Here was one of his closest friends and associates. And yet Meese walks into the place, and it was the first time he had ever been in the house. He walks in. When Reagan leaves the governorship of California, Meese and Bill Clark and a bunch of his other top aides buy a painting for him of sort of a California mountain scene, which is hanging there. Meese walks in, sees it on the wall, and begins to cry because he never knew what happened to the picture. He never knew that Reagan thought this was so important to Reagan that he took it with him and hung it prominently on the wall of his sort of, cave of solitude, whatever it is. Reagan would sit there and he would literally, I was with John Barletta, who's his Secret Service writing buddy, and he said Reagan would fall asleep in one chair. He would always read there. His military aides would bring him in his paperwork, and he would do it on his lap. And it was really a remarkable insight into the 40th President of the United States. It was really, I walked away just blown away what a decent guy this was and how much she loved him. To have taken, this woman of elegance to live to spend a considerable amount of her time because she loved him in the place that he loved, which was, she had a bell so that when she fixed him his meals, she would go out and ring the bell. And he had a bell near the stables, and when he got her horse ready, he would go out and ring the bell at the stables. It was very funny. I mean, I walked away just completely mind blown about it.
It really is a symbol of the West, individual liberties, freedom that he so embodied and that he took to Washington with him. Thinking about that.
One second. I don't want to avoid answering the question. Look, I have not spent years in politics to walk away. And I hope, and particularly since I know what they want. What they want is for people who think like you and I do to become, despair. Oh, God, things are so bad. They passed that health care bill. We aren't going to be able to undo it. Oh, God, the country's going in the wrong direction. You know what? They've got all the votes, all the power, throw it in. I'm not going to do that. I just am not, and I hope you don't either.
Good.
Now's the time to stand up.
Somebody also asked in that regard, they said, what would you think if Congress went to a part-time legislature like we have in Texas?
I got to tell you, I think it's one of the great things. I think it's one of the great things. I think that look, I used to be a fan of term limits. I'm not certain I'm so much a fan anymore.
Right.
But I do think the idea of saying we're going to limit the amount of days you can be in Washington, and maybe even saying we're going to make you dependent upon, $180-some-odd thousand a year, that's a lot of money compared to the ordinary American. And maybe we ought to say, you don't get a pay raise. In fact, we're going to cut your pay, and we're going to aim for a part-time legislature. Think about the difference. California and Texas.
Exactly.
California is a full-time legislature. They pay them generously. They spend all their time in Sacramento, and all they do is find ways to pass laws.
And spend money.
Yeah. And here in Texas, we have a different attitude. You got to go home and live under the laws you pass. You're only there for 140 days every 2 years, and you pass a biennial budget, and you get paid with $600 a month. I want you to think about this. Every census since Texas has come into the Union, we have gained population and gained seats in the United States House of Representatives. We will pick up 4 seats in the next reapportionment. In the next reapportionment, for the first time since 1850, the state of California will not gain a seat in Congress because its population growth has lagged the rest of the country. First time ever. That says something about the divergence between these two big states.
Absolutely. And I guess that goes back to your comment about when you offer yourself for public service, particularly in the United States Congress and in other high offices, you need to know how to say no. And so, I think
which is not easy to do, because look,
not.
there are 3 parties in Congress. There are Republicans, Democrats, and appropriators. And guess who the majority is?
The appropriators.
The appropriators.
Right, absolutely. And in that regard, how can, or what do you see as the way out or the way forward on these recent events in Greece and the out-of-control spending and the challenges that these countries are having now and that we will soon face if we don't get a handle on our debt?
This is the biggest challenge domestically the country faces because, look, this is very problematic. First of all, we have the $787 billion stimulus bill, which turns out not to be 787, but I don't know if you saw, but in February, the CBO said, oops, there was a tiny little mistake in the formulas, and it's not 787, it's 862. There's a 852, excuse me. There's a $75 billion mistake, 9% off. So which close enough for government work in Washington nowadays. But if you add up the cost of the stimulus, and incidentally, the stimulus, remember President Obama said it's going to be spent right away? Go to recovery.org, which is the official website for the Recovery Act. And incidentally, isn't the internet a great thing? Thank God for Al Gore. Really terrific. Really well done. Really well done. But you go there, and only 40% of the stimulus money has been spent. We're going to spend more money under the so-called stimulus bill between 2011, next year, and the end of the 10-year window, 2019, than we spent last year, 2009, when we're ostensibly trying to stimulate the economy. It's like some guy has a heart attack, and the EMS shows up and says, takes out the paddles and says, everybody stand clear, this is going to take a week or two. And the guy's going to be dead. And the other thing about it is that if you add it up, the 787, which turns into 852, excuse me, and then you add on top the interest that we're going to pay over the 10-year window as a result of that money, and we're going to be spending somewhere north of $1.2 trillion more than we were anticipating to spend the day before President Obama was sworn in. Now, we all know that because that's visible. Let me tell you something else you probably don't know. In the middle of the fiscal year runs, essentially October, starts in October, runs to the end of October. President Obama comes in January. He then asked for an 8% increase in discretionary non-security spending in the middle of the fiscal year to drive it from $393 billion to $410. Actually, it's $413, but don't ask me to explain why. It's complicated, but middle of the year, blah, 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 blah. So anyway, you got an 8% increase. He then turns around and on top of that new baseline of 410, asks for a 12% increase on top of that, just under $50 billion more, which means that between January 20th of last year and November 1, we increased discretionary non-security spending by about 67, nearly $68 billion. If you work that out over the course of the decade, it means that we're going to be spending somewhere north of $800 billion in money and interest that we would otherwise not have been paying given the forecast, given the projected spending as of January 20th, 2009. Think about that. We're going to spend $2 trillion more, even if we keep it at flatline it for the rest of the decade and don't increase it. And we don't have it. And that's before we get to the stupid health care bill, which I can really rant and rave about if you got a question in
Well,
there.
go right ahead. The question, one of these questions was, what can we do once we regain the majority in 2010?
Or 2012.
How can we pull back?
Well, first of all, the good news
is
is we've got time. Of the $950 billion in the first 10 years, don't you love this? This thing is only going to cost us $950 billion. This is less than $1 trillion.
a bargain.
A bargain. Of course, remember this. We have 10 years worth of revenue increases, 10 years of taxes, and 10 years worth of benefit cuts in this thing. But the two big cost drivers are an expansion of Medicaid. We're going to expand Medicaid by a third. And we're going to spend $434 billion over the 10-year window in order to do that. And then after all those evil insurance companies with their out there profiteering that President Obama warned us about, the other big part of this $950 billion program is $466 billion in subsidies to insurance companies. Now, the $900 billion and the $950 billion cost is in two elements. Neither one of those elements begins for 4 years, and they aren't fully ramped up for 7 years. We spend 81% of the Medicaid money between 2016 and 2019, and 84% of the subsidy money between 2016 and 2019, way out there in the future. Now, why is it taking so long? This thing is supposed to save us $143 billion and do all kinds of good things for our healthcare system, so why is it taking so long? I've talked to governors and legislators about how long would it take you to expand Medicaid, and they said, look, if we had to do it, it would be literally a matter of weeks or months. It took Massachusetts less than a year to set up its exchanges. Why is it taking us 7 years? And the answer is simple. There are two of them. One is the true cost of this program is not the first 10 years, it's the first 10 years of its operation, 2016 to 2025, and the cost there is $2.6 trillion. Do you think they could have passed this thing if they said, look, we can start these things right away, and the first 10 years it's going to cost us $2.3, $2.4 trillion? Do you think the American people would have stood by for it? And here's the other problem. It's unsustainable. We're taking 10 years worth of tax increases and up to 10 years worth of Medicaid care cuts in order to pay for a program that doesn't start spending real money for 4 years and isn't spend most of that money until 7 years from now, years 7, 8, 9, and 10. How sustainable is a program like that? And then the other thing is that it is completely phony accounting. We sent Bernie Madoff to jail. I think they bailed Jeff Skilling out of jail in order to have him help write the financing for it. They say, look, ain't it great? We got a $38 trillion unfunded liability in Medicare, which is true. Over the next 75 years, it's anticipated to cost us $38 trillion more. $38 trillion more than we take in. That's equivalent to roughly 2.5 times the annual size of today's American economy over the next 75 years. So they say, look, isn't it great? We're going to cut $456 billion from Medicare over the next 10 years. And because we lower the baseline over the next 10 years, that will ripple through for the next 65 years that come after that. Because you cut it now, you'll end up spending less over the long haul than you would have otherwise spent. And we'll save $30 trillion. And Medicare will be much more solvent. It will be easier to solve the problem. Sounds really good, except they then say, remember that $456 billion that we're applying to the unfunded liability on Medicare? Oh, we're also going to spend it for the current expenses of the health care program. Now, you can't do both. You can't say, I'm applying it to the unfunded liability, that is to say, not spending that money, and then turn around and say, I'm going to spend it on the cost of the health care program. They got $50 billion plus, $53 billion in payments into Social Security. They assume people are going to lose their coverage, and the employer, in lieu of giving them health care coverage, is going to give them a pay raise, and as a result, it changes health care from being a not taxable event, to compensation, which is taxable, and as a result, people are going to pay $53 billion more in Social Security payroll taxes, which is going into the Social Security Trust Fund to pay somebody's Social Security check that they're due down the line. And oh, incidentally, we're also spending that same $50 billion a second time for the current expenses of the new health program. You can't do that. You can't send the same dollar twice. It's either over there in the Social Security Trust Fund or it's being spent for the current expenses. It's not both places. If you borrow it, you have to pay it back. Then they got a new long-term entitlement program called CLASS, which is a long-term care benefit, where they say you can buy a policy from the federal government that'll pay you $50 a day for long-term care if you need it when you're old. There are programs like that already available from private insurance companies. They say we're going to create a new government one to compete with it because, as we know from the post office, the government does a damn good job of competing well with that private providers. So they say there are going to be $70 billion of premium payments on those insurance policies, which should be, which are going to be held there so they can pay the benefit at some future time. And incidentally, we're also taking that same $70 billion in premium payments and spending them on the current expenses of the health care program. Look, I got a 21-year-old off at college. Hey, Bubba, there's a certain amount of money you get each month. When it's gone, it's gone. And yet these guys are double counting it. In fact, they also took $208 billion for the so-called Medicare doc fix. Every year, we have to adjust the payments for docs under Medicare. We do a lousy job of it, but we're supposed to adjust it every year to keep them pace with inflation. It's going to cost $208 billion for the next 10 years. Rather than putting it in the health care bill, they said, well, we can't do that because it changes it from being $143 billion in the black. It'll change it to being $70 billion in the red. So let's just take that and hide it over there in the corner and hope that nobody pays attention to it for a couple of months, and then we'll come back and fix it. If you take the $143 billion in the black that they say it is today, and you stop the double counting, 456, 50 billion, 70 billion, add in the $208 billion for the Medicare doc fix and adjust it because you have to because of the impact that these things have on each other. And this thing is not $143 billion in the black in the first 10 years. It is $618 billion in the red on a base total of $950 billion of expenditures. What the heck are they doing? Are we that stupid? Do they think we're that stupid that they can get away with it? So, look, we got to repeal this thing and replace it with true reforms that will lower the cost of health insurance and make it more accessible to everyone. Look, okay. Let me rant and rave for 3 minutes more on this subject. Why are we doing this? 83% of the American people have health care coverage and like it. Now, we do have a problem that 91% think they do have health care coverage. I'm worried about the delta between, the 8% that think they do and don't. Don't worry, honey, we're covered. But 83% like what they got. Oh, the president said we got 46 or 47 million uninsured in America. That's a big number. That's a frightening number when you think about it. So let's understand it. Who are they? If you go to the Census Bureau and read the numbers, 9.7 million of them are legal or illegal aliens. Now, I don't think the U.S. taxpayer ought to be picking up the tab for people who are here legally or illegally and are not U.S. citizens. We got 18 million who make $50,000 or more a year. They tend to be young. They think they're bulletproof. I wish they had insurance. If they got sick or got in an accident, I bet they wish they had some too. And they can afford it. They could go out, even if you're 25 and you're a hot shot, working someplace downtown for some oil company as a software engineer, you could go buy yourself a catastrophic policy. You'd have to pay for your out-of-pocket stuff, but if you got really sick or got injured badly, there'd be a catastrophic policy. But these people make money, and they made a decision not to buy insurance. And as much as I think they should have insurance, they have made a decision not to, and last time I checked, we're a nation of individual responsibility and personal freedom, and we shouldn't be picking up the tab for people who can afford it themselves. We shouldn't.
That's right.
We got 14 million people out of that number who are already eligible for some form of government-provided assistance. They're eligible for Medicaid, Medicare, S-CHIP, Indian health care, TRICARE, CHAMPUS, or VA, or some other form of government-provided health care. And guess what? The government has done a lousy job of signing them up. So is the answer to create yet another government program so it can do an equally terrible job of signing them up, and in the process discombobulate the relationship of 83% of the American people with their provider?
No.
Look, we got the best healthcare system in the world in many ways. We also got big problems. We've got, 46 or 47 minus 10, minus 18, minus 14, and you got about 5 or 6 million people. And that is a big number, and I worry about those people. These are people who are working, so they make too much to get into Medicaid, and they don't get coverage from their employer, and they don't make enough to even get a catastrophic policy on their own. But maybe we ought to be focused on designing a system that helps them rather than just blowing up the whole thing that we got. It's just unbelievably ridiculous.
That's right. I can't wait until you're a visiting professor here at HBU and our students get to hear this in class.
Oh, wait until I get them. I taught at the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Policy at the University of Texas.
That's right.
God has a sense of humor, or there is a affirmative action for Republicans, because I was the only Republican member of the faculty.
That's exactly right.
But I enjoyed it, and I also taught in the undergraduate school for a number of years, but I require a lot of writing, and I'm a tough grader and show up on time.
That's good. That's good. Last question. With all of these challenges facing our country, what makes you optimistic about America now?
First of all, I think Americans are naturally optimistic people. I mean, we just are. But I'm also optimistic because what I see happening out there. Take health care. If you go back a year ago, January, February, March of last year, the polls showed that people were in favor of health care reform as a concept by about 2 to 1. The President, on March 5th of last year, kicks off his drive for health care reform, gives 58 speeches in 51 weeks. And yet people went out and educated themselves about the bill, talked to their doc, talked to their nurse, talked to the hospital administrator, read about it, followed it. And by August, we were spun up. The Tea Party movement, first in reaction to the spending and then in reaction to the health care, had us all spun up by August. Mm-hmm. And if you look at, Leah, raise your hand. Who tried to download the bill in December? How many of you actually succeeded? Think about all these trees that were killed unnecessarily. But look, think about that. You're downloading a 2,036-page bill and trying to make heads and tails of it. That's how strong it was. And if you take a look at the polls in the 2 weeks leading up to the vote, and you look at the questions that sort of said, are you in favor of the bill now before Congress, supported by the President and the Democratic leadership, it was 38% in favor and 60% opposed. 2%, only 2% of the American people had no opinion. And this bill got less popular after it was passed. The strongly opposed, incidentally, outnumbered the strongly favored by 2 to 1. So, I look at that and I say, the level of intensity is wild. I keep running into, as I go around the country and sign at these book signings, people will come up to me and say, I organized the Tea Party in Marianna, Florida. Or I had dinner with the woman who organized the Tea Party in front of Nancy Pelosi's office in San Francisco. Ran off the flyers on her home computer, hung them up, and 1,500 people showed up in San Francisco. And I ask them, I say, what did you do politically? And 9 times out of 10, when I say, what did you do politically before? 9 times out of 10, they say nothing. I voted. So I see that. But I'll tell you, there's even more. One thing I learned at the White House, look, I was really smart before I showed up there. I knew everything. I had a series of extraordinary experiences that helped me understand our country better and understand how important we are in the world. But the most extraordinary experience I had was the last week I was there. And it was really funny it's ironic that it would happen literally the last week I was there, because it illuminated in sharp relief things that I'd seen before and not fully grasped the significance of. That week was sort of, as you might expect, sort of emotional. I didn't want to go. I had to. I had asked way too much of my family, and it was time for me to go. And I'd wanted to walk out, January 20th, 2009, and, turn out the lights. So the last week I was there, we were flying to Reno, Nevada, as I mentioned. The President was going to speak to the American Legion. And this was going to be sort of emotional for me because First of all, it was my last trip as a senior aide to the president. I was going to be the senior guy on the trip, so I was in charge. And we were flying on Air Force One. It would be the last time I flew on Air Force One as a senior aide to the president. And I was going home because I spent part of my childhood in Sparks, Nevada, a little railroad town outside of Reno, and I got family all over the place out there. It was also going to be tough, and it was emotional because this is the first time Bush had gone to northern Nevada with lots of time on his schedule, since the balloon went up in Afghanistan. So it was the first time that he could meet with the families of the fallen in northern Nevada. I mean, he did this about every week or two, but this is the first time he was in northern Nevada, and there were 13 families from northern Nevada. And it was going to be my job to staff the meetings. And I read the biographies keenly of each one of these 13 because I was from this part of the world. So I knew them. I could read their biographies, and I knew their neighborhoods, and I knew the communities. I knew where they came from. I didn't know them personally, but I knew a lot about them. One guy went to the same dinky little junior high I went to, Dilworth Junior High, Sparks, Nevada. So the president made this speech to the American Legion, and it was spectacular. I mean, they just were wild. Afterwards, we went back behind the curtain into the convention, the back rooms of the convention center, dressing rooms and green rooms and so forth, and met with families. About the third or fourth family we walked into, there was a mom, a dad, and a son. This couple had had two boys. Their oldest boy, Marine First Lieutenant Nathan Krisoff, was killed in Anbar in 2006. And his mom and his dad and his younger brother were there. Nathan Krisoff was the only member of his graduating class at Williams, one of the many Ivies, to enlist in the military. And when he enlisted, his younger brother was so inspired that he joined Marine ROTC. And he was sitting there in his Marine dress uniform, Austin Krisoff, and he was going to be deployed to Iraq in March of 2008. The mom and the dad were there. The dad, both of them were dressed in black, and it was very funny. I mentioned earlier about how you remember funny things. I remember the dad had a very thin black tie. It was one of these weird, thin, very thin black ties. And he didn't say a single word. The mom spoke, and she was a remarkable human being, really something. She was poised, she was thoughtful, she was articulate, and it was really amazing to listen to her because she talked about how when Nathan would come off a combat patrol, he would email her. For those of us who had relatives who fought in World War II or Korea or Vietnam or Gulf War, I mean, I remember waiting for the letters from my uncle in Vietnam, the little blue tissue things that came from Vietnam. And here he gets off a combat patrol, wipes the grime off of his face and says, "Hey, Mom, you up?" In fact, sometimes she said they would, if the hour was right and he had the right internet connection, they would load up their cameras on either side and look at each other. Imagine how that's powerful a connection there has to be on the modern battlefield. She talked about the war on terror in a really profound and thoughtful way. And she talked about the stakes, she talked about the enemy we face, she talked about the consequences if we won, the consequences if we lost. Somebody once said to me when I described her, he said, "Well, what did she say exactly?" And I said, "Hey, look, man, don't bother me about it. It was like listening to a really good-looking Henry Kissinger." She's really smart. And it was powerful because she talked about her fears. She talked about her fears of her only remaining child who was going to be going to the same exact place that killed her first boy. And she talked about the kind of world that she wanted to see if she were given the chance to have grandchildren. It was powerful. I mean, really emotional. I'm standing over at the corner of the room taking notes and trying to keep it together as best I can while she talks. And the president was visiting with her. So after about 20, 25 minutes, there'd been some laughter, and there'd been some, tears, and there'd been some, earnest conversation, but it was sort of running out of gas. And so finally the president said, as he always did at these meetings, he said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Because the military gets a lot right, but there's always loose ends in these kind of situations. The stepdad and the mom got the flag, the mom and the stepdad didn't at gravesite. The military transportation rights have not been clarified. The checks are going to the wrong address. One time a family said to the president, weirdest request I had to handle, they said, "Mr. President, there's a parcel of land between the road and the cemetery. Can the federal government get the water rights so the grass will always be green around our son's gravesite?" So making notes. So the president says, yeah, is there anything I can do for you? And at that, Bill Krisoff spoke up. He said, yeah, Mr. President, there's something you can do for me. He said, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and I'm a pretty good one. He said, when my boy is deployed to Iraq next March, I'd like to be in the United States Navy Medical Reserve providing health care to the Marines. But they won't let me in, Mr. President, because I'm 60 years old. Mr. President, will you give me an age waiver to join the Marines? The president said, talk to Karl. So we exchanged business cards, and I start to check the guy out on the way back to Washington. I've got family and friends there, and I call and start checking the guy out. And by the next morning, I've got a pretty good picture of this guy. Top of his class, University of Colorado, best bone doc in northern Nevada. If you got a need of an orthopedic surgeon, you try and get on his dance card. He practices at 3 hospitals. They have a $1 million house up in the hills above Reno. He runs marathons at the age of 60. Both of his boys were national junior kayak finalists because their old man took them out on the Truckee River and taught them how to do it. And he is one exceptional, as she is also an exceptional human being. I mean, they are really, everybody just sings their praises. This guy faxes me his application. And I'm so obsessed about it that I've got a jar of whiteout, and I'm sitting at my desk in the West Wing cleaning up the guy's application before I make a photocopy of it. I make a copy of it. I put it in a special file folder, 6:30 on Thursday morning. I'm in Oval Office waiting for the president to come in. When he comes in, I described him, I gave him the folder, I described him what I found out, who I've heard from, because Pete Pace, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, is coming by that day for a meeting. He himself is a Marine. There are no docs in the Marines. Health care for Marines is provided by the Navy. So the Marines may speak ill of every swabby they know, but they will not speak ill of a Navy doc. Right. So Pete Pace is coming in, and I give the president the file. I tell Karen Keller, the president's assistant, call me when Pace arrives, because I want to make sure the president talks to him. So she calls me. I take a bunch of paperwork, walk down the hallway, sit down outside the Oval Office, and do my paperwork while I'm waiting for Pace. About 20, 25 minutes later, he comes out. And I said, General, did the president talk to you about Bill Krisoff? And he waves the file folder and says, yeah, I'm on top of it. I'll get back to you soon with an answer. I said, you can't get back to me. I said, I'm leaving tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Will you please get back to Joe Hagan, whom Charles knows?
Sure.
And he says, I'm on it. So that's Thursday. Friday, I leave at 3 o'clock. One of the last things I do at the White House is handwrite a note on White House stationery to Bill Krisoff and tell him how inspiring it was to meet him and wishing him well. Hope it works out. And I put my own stamp on the envelope. And I walk out at 3 o'clock, get in a car, and do what any self-respecting Texan would do. I fly to Austin, pick up my boy from school, and drive to Marathon in order to be out hunting dove on the first day of dove season the next morning. So I'm out there on J.P. Bryan's ranch, south of Marathon, popping the birds pretty well, if I say so myself. But I can't stop thinking about this family. And I can't stop thinking about them. And then I realized I wrote the wrong person. I wrote Bill. I had not written her. I mean, think about that woman. Loses her oldest boy in combat. Has her younger child, her only other child, going into harm's way. And then her nutty husband pops up and says, honey, let's take everything we got in life, our comfortable existence, my practice, your horse, your horse friends, our wonderful, place and our wonderful life and all of our friends and all of our connections to community, and let's flush them so I can go join the Navy and go off to fight a war at the age of 60, approaching 61. And this remarkable woman says, that sounds like a terrific idea. So I sat down at the Gage Hotel that night and wrote her a note. 3 weeks later, I got a note from them saying they had shuttered up the house in Reno and had taken an apartment in San Diego and were hopeful that Bill could pass basic training. I later by accident, ran into the guy who was in charge of the OCS candidate class that Bill got tossed in the middle of. So he's tossed in with a bunch of 23, 24, and 25-year-old hotshots, including some enlisted Marines who got into OCS school, the OCS track, and for training, for their basic. And this guy said, Bill Krisoff completed in 3 months what normally took Navy doctors a year to do. And he said what really irritated the 23 and 24 and 25-year-old OCS hotshots was that at the end of the day, in order to blow off steam, this guy and his class, including Kristoff, would get in kayaks off of Coronado and go kayaking, and it just chapped these young guys that some reason or other, Bill Kristoff was in the lead every single day, which this guy obviously took great delight in. Mm-hmm. About 3 months later, I got an invitation to his commissioning ceremony. And his younger son, when Bill was commissioned, his younger son was there and said, "Welcome to the fight, Dad."
They truly represent the best that America is.
Yeah. April of last year, Bill sent me an email with 3 pictures. One was a picture of him in his operating suite in Baghdad. And a complaint, he said, "All I get is sports injuries." He said, "All these young Marines play roughhouse on basketball court or whatever." And he said, all I get is, I think I would be better used in Afghanistan where our boys are getting shot. The second picture was a picture of Bill in his combat uniform with a very cool sidearm in a holster on the middle of his chest, wearing his combat hat and in the helmet, and in the back is an osprey, because his CO said, "You can take the milk run out to Anbar for lunch. We're going to have to deliver some medical supplies out there. You go out and deliver the supplies and take time to have lunch." And the next picture is him having lunch in the mess tent with Austin, his son. So he sends these to me, and so I wrote him back, because we were corresponding by email, and I wrote him back and I said, "Bill, I would really like to write about you. I'd like to write about your story in my book, and I'd like to write a column for the Wall Street Journal about you." And a day or two later, he wrote me back and said, "Go ahead. I've talked to Christine, and go ahead. If you think it's useful, if you think people want to hear about that, go ahead." So I wrote it. It appeared 1 year ago tomorrow in the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
That day, I got an email from Bill saying, first of all, "Thanks for being so kind to Christine," which, you couldn't help but be. And then he said, "I don't know if it's fortuitous or not, but he said, this morning the Navy offered, and I've accepted a 3-year extension of my active duty status." This guy's going to turn 65 in the military.
That's amazing.
About 5 weeks ago, Bill was deployed to Afghanistan. And about 3 weeks ago, I got to have breakfast in San Diego with Christine and Austin. And look, this illuminated a lot for me, and it makes me very optimistic about our country, because I saw what these people did. I saw what this family did to honor the sacrifice of their son. And I look back and I see so many other people who found their own way to love our country and serve it. I met a kid who was a magna cum laude graduate from Harvard in mathematics, who rather than going to Wall Street and making $1 gazillion was teaching 7th grade math in a charter school in Harlem. And when I asked him why he was doing it, he said it seemed like the right thing to do. I remember meeting business executives, very busy business executives in Charlotte, North Carolina, Mecklenburg County, who were running these big enterprises and doing lots of things, but every one of them had taken a personal responsibility to mentor a single welfare mom in her journey from dependency on government and welfare to to independence and self-respect and the dignity of work. And it was pretty remarkable. I mean, it was even more remarkable when I understood what the sacrifice had involved. I met the young doctor and his wife from Fargo, North Dakota, where they'd grown up. They had a very successful practice, a lovely community where they all family and friends, but they felt called by their faith to serve something greater than self, and so they picked the poorest place they could find in America, the Mississippi Delta, and moved there in order to serve the poor and provide health care. And look, I can't do anything for Bill and Christine Kristoff except send them flowers on one special day in December and keep in touch with them and surround them with as much prayer and love as I can. But they are a powerful reminder of who we are as a country.
Absolutely.
And who couldn't be optimistic about a people that can give birth to that kind of a family? I mean, who could be optimistic about the future of our country with people like that? And if you turn around, they're on every street corner, in every community, in every neighborhood, doing something to serve a cause greater than themselves. So I'm optimistic because of politics. I mean, the generic battle is looking good, the blah, blah, blah. But I am fundamentally most optimistic about our country because, you know what, we're Americans. And as long as we remain what we are, this extraordinary people, will remain the greatest nation on the face of the planet and the greatest nation in the history of the world.
Karl, you are a Texas treasure, an American hero, and a great friend to so many, and we appreciate your time with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Karl Rove.
Thank you, Charles. That was fun.
Thank you, buddy. This was an honor for me. Let me tell you.
Thank you.